I need to explain why I'm recording this, why after 23 years of loyal Imperial service, I'm sitting in a storage compartment aboard a transport heading nowhere important, speaking into a voice recorder that will probably be discovered and used as evidence in my eventual treason trial. My name is Archivist Second Class Manitolvus, Imperial Records Bureau, Historical Revision Division, and for the past 9 years my assignment has been to systematically erase the Jedi Order from documented history, to replace factual accounts with approved narratives that portray them as corrupt sorcerers who manipulated the Republic for their own gain. The work was straightforward initially, just editing temple records and scholarly texts and educational materials to reflect official Imperial doctrine. But 3 months ago, I was assigned to a special project that changed everything, that exposed me to information I wasn't supposed to synthesize into coherent understanding, that revealed patterns the Empire had worked very hard to obscure beneath layers of misdirection and bureaucratic fragmentation. The project concerned Naboo, specifically the events 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, specifically the Trade Federation blockade and the battle that ended it, and specifically the death of Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn at the hands of the Sith Lord who would eventually become the catalyst for everything that followed. I was supposed to revise those records to minimize Jedi involvement and emphasize the Senate's diplomatic resolution, but what I found in the unredacted source materials was something else entirely. Something that suggested Qui-Gon Jinn's death wasn't random tragedy, but carefully orchestrated sacrifice that served interests. I didn't understand until I started connecting it to other events that the Imperial censors had deliberately separated to prevent exactly the kind of synthesis I'm about to describe. The assignment arrived through normal channels, a priority revision request from the Imperial Palace, with attached security classifications that required me to work in an isolated archive vault without networked access, without colleagues who might observe what I was reviewing, without any of the normal oversight that characterized historical revision work. The request specified that I was to prepare new educational materials about the Naboo crisis that would be distributed to Imperial academies throughout the core worlds. Materials that would present the crisis as example of Republic corruption and Jedi incompetence, while demonstrating how the Empire's formation prevented such governance failures from recurring. Standard propaganda work, the kind of assignment I had completed hundreds of times, except this time the source materials were unusually comprehensive, included intelligence reports and Jedi Council records and Senate committee transcripts that I had never seen before despite working in the archives for nearly a decade. Someone had collected everything related to Naboo, had assembled a complete documentary record that covered every aspect of the crisis, from Trade Federation planning through the final battle, and they had given me access to all of it with instructions to extract only the pieces that supported the approved narrative while ignoring everything else. I should have followed those instructions literally, should have skimmed the materials for useful quotes and context, while dismissing the rest as irrelevant to my assignment. But I made the mistake of being thorough, of actually reading the complete record to understand the full context before deciding which elements to include in the revision. That thoroughness revealed something the fragmentary presentation was designed to conceal. The Naboo crisis wasn't spontaneous political conflict that spiraled into violence, but carefully orchestrated an operation that served multiple objectives simultaneously. And Qui-Gon Jinn's presence there wasn't coincidence but essential element in a plan that required his specific capabilities and, eventually, his death. The realization came gradually as I cross-referenced documents, noticed patterns in timing and decision-making that suggested coordination between supposedly independent actors, recognized that what appeared to be chaos and improvisation was actually precision choreography, where every participant played roles they didn't fully understand while serving interests that remained invisible to all except the person directing the entire performance. The Trade Federation blockade of Naboo made no economic sense, which was the first indication that official explanations were inadequate. The planet wasn't strategically critical, didn't possess unique resources worth the military investment required to occupy it, didn't represent symbolic target that would intimidate other systems into accepting Trade Federation demands. The official imperial narrative claimed the blockade was protest against Republic taxation policies, but the timeline didn't support that explanation because the tax legislation had passed months earlier and other systems with more significant trade relationships hadn't been targeted. Something else was driving the Federation's actions, some incentive or threat that made Naboo specifically important despite its apparent insignificance. And the answer became visible when I found the communications logs between Viceroy Gunray and his mysterious contact, the Sith Lord who presented himself as political ally but who was actually manipulating the Federation into creating the precise crisis conditions necessary for subsequent events. The Sith Lord's identity was never explicitly confirmed in the documents I reviewed, but the pattern of his interventions matched the style that would later characterize Darth Sidious: the measured manipulation and strategic patience and absolute certainty about how targets would respond to carefully calibrated pressure. He convinced Gunray that occupying Naboo would demonstrate Federation power and intimidate the Senate into reversing taxation policies, promised political support that would protect the Federation from Republic military response, and specifically requested that they make the blockade visible and aggressive enough to trigger Jedi intervention. That last detail was crucial because it revealed that Jedi involvement wasn't unfortunate complication but intended outcome, that the entire crisis was designed to attract specific Jedi attention and draw them into situation where their participation would serve purposes they couldn't anticipate. The Jedi Council's response was exactly what the Sith Lord had predicted. They sent Qui-Gon Jinn and his Padawan Obi-Wan Kenobi as negotiators, selected them specifically because Qui-Gon's reputation for unorthodox problem-solving and political subtlety made him ideal for resolving trade disputes without military escalation. The choice seemed reasonable based on Council intelligence about the crisis, but that intelligence was itself curated, shaped by information the Sith Lord had ensured reached Coruscant through channels that appeared independent, but that all served his narrative about what the Naboo situation required. Qui-Gon was the perfect tool for purposes he didn't know he was serving, powerful enough to survive the initial complications, but not so powerful that he could perceive the larger manipulation, principled enough to commit fully to protecting Naboo, but flexible enough to improvise when standard Jedi protocols proved inadequate and, most importantly, possessed of specific qualities that made him uniquely valuable for the final stage of the plan that required his death. I found this gradually as I worked through the timeline, noticed how events that appeared chaotic or coincidental were actually precisely timed interventions that kept moving all participants toward predetermined outcomes. The assassination attempt on Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan aboard the Federation flagship failed not because Jedi combat skills were superior, but because the Sith Lord had specifically instructed the Federation to use methods that wouldn't kill immediately, that would drive the Jedi to escape rather than die, because their escape was necessary for subsequent events. Their flight to Naboo's surface and encounter with Jar Jar Binks connected them to the Gungan population that would eventually provide military resources for the final battle, another seemingly random encounter that was actually an essential link in chain of events leading toward specific outcome. Their journey to Theed and rescue of Queen Amidala put them in position to discover the occupation and commit to reversing it, transformed their mission from neutral negotiation to active resistance against the Federation, exactly the emotional and strategic commitment necessary for them to pursue the crisis to its conclusion rather than reporting back to Coruscant for additional support. The escape from Naboo and subsequent landing on Tatooine introduced the most important variable in the entire operation. Anakin Skywalker, 9-year-old slave boy who Qui-Gon immediately recognized as unusually strong in the Force and who he believed might be the chosen one prophesied to bring balance. Finding Anakin wasn't coincidence any more than the other elements were coincidence. The Sith Lord had known he was there, had tracked the Skywalker bloodline for purposes that remained unclear in my source documents, but that obviously related to long-term planning that extended decades beyond the immediate crisis. Qui-Gon's discovery of Anakin, his decision to bring the boy to Coruscant for Jedi training, his commitment to mentoring him despite Council skepticism, all of these emerged from Qui-Gon's genuine commitment to Jedi principles and his belief in prophecy, but they also served the Sith Lord's objectives perfectly because they ensured Anakin would be inserted into Jedi Order at exactly the moment when his presence would create maximum long-term disruption. The Council's initial rejection of Anakin's training created the first crack in what would eventually become catastrophic fault line in his psychological development. Qui-Gon had presented the boy as chosen one, had invested enormous significance in his potential, and then the Council had evaluated him and declared him too old, too emotionally attached, too dangerous to train according to normal Jedi protocols. The rejection wounded something fundamental in Anakin's sense of worth, created doubt about whether he deserved the special status Qui-Gon had attributed to him, and that doubt would fester for years before eventually manifesting as the vulnerability that Darth Sidious would exploit to complete Anakin's transformation into Darth Vader. But in the immediate term, the Council's rejection served another purpose. It meant that Qui-Gon had to defy their decision, had to commit fully to training Anakin despite institutional resistance, had to make Anakin's acceptance personal crusade that would override his normal deference to Council authority. That commitment was essential for the final phase, for ensuring that Qui-Gon would be present on Naboo during the battle rather than remaining on Coruscant where Council could supervise his activities. He returned to Naboo with Obi-Wan and Anakin because he had convinced Queen Amidala to reclaim her planet and because his commitment to both her cause and Anakin's training meant he couldn't abandon either objective, and his presence in the Theed Palace during the final battle put him in position to encounter the Sith Lord's apprentice, Darth Maul, who had been sent specifically to engage Qui-Gon in lightsaber combat and ensure a particular outcome. The Council records about the duel were fragmentary, based on Obi-Wan's traumatized testimony and on security footage from the Theed power generator that captured only portions of the fight. But what emerged clearly was that Darth Maul had been superior combatant, faster and more aggressive and more committed to killing than Qui-Gon had expected, and that the Jedi Master had died not from lack of skill, but from momentary exhaustion that created opening. Maul exploited with precision that suggested he had been trained specifically to kill experienced Jedi through exactly that technique. Qui-Gon's death served multiple purposes simultaneously, which was why I became convinced it was orchestrated rather than tragic accident. Most immediately, it ensured that Anakin's training would be conducted by Obi-Wan, young Jedi Knight who had just been elevated from Padawan status and who lacked the experience and wisdom necessary to handle student as complex and challenging as Anakin. Qui-Gon would have been better mentor, would have understood Anakin's emotional needs, and adapted traditional Jedi training to accommodate them, but Qui-Gon died and Obi-Wan inherited responsibility he wasn't prepared for, and that inadequacy created the environment where Anakin's attachment issues and fear of loss and need for validation went unaddressed until they became psychological vulnerabilities that Sidious could manipulate. The Sith Lord had predicted this, had understood that Qui-Gon's death would result in Anakin being trained by someone constitutionally incapable of providing what the boy needed, and he had arranged circumstances to ensure that prediction became reality. But the death served another purpose that was less obvious, but potentially more important. It demonstrated to Obi-Wan and the Jedi Council that the Sith had returned, that the ancient enemies thought extinct for millennium were active and dangerous and willing to kill Jedi Masters in direct combat. That demonstration triggered the Council's investigation into Sith survival and eventually led them to heightened vigilance about political manipulation and hidden threats. But that vigilance was itself part of the Sith plan because it made the Jedi paranoid and defensive, made them see threats everywhere and trust their instincts less, created psychological environment where they would eventually fail to recognize the actual threat operating directly in front of them for years. Qui-Gon's death was the opening move in decade-long campaign to undermine Jedi confidence and effectiveness, and its success depended on the death being real rather than staged, on Obi-Wan witnessing his master die and carrying that trauma forward into his own development as Jedi Knight and Anakin's teacher. I spent 3 weeks reviewing these materials, cross-referencing timelines and communications logs and intelligence reports, building comprehensive understanding of how the Naboo crisis had been orchestrated and what purposes it served. And the more I understood, the more disturbed I became, because the implications extended far beyond that single event. If the Sith Lord who manipulated the Trade Federation and arranged Qui-Gon's death was the same person who eventually became Emperor Palpatine, which seemed probable based on pattern analysis and operational style, then the entire Clone Wars and the fall of the Republic and the Jedi Purge were all extensions of planning that began decades earlier, intricate multi-stage operation where every major event served purposes that wouldn't become clear until much later. Qui-Gon Jinn's death wasn't isolated tragedy, but essential element in machine that would eventually consume the Jedi Order and transform the Republic into the Empire I now served. And recognizing that pattern meant recognizing that everything I had been taught about the Empire's formation was sophisticated lie that concealed systematic manipulation operating across decades and involving thousands of orchestrated events that all served single ultimate objective. The Historical Revision Division existed specifically to prevent people like me from making connections like these, from synthesizing the fragmented information into coherent narrative that revealed the Empire's foundations were built on calculated deception and carefully orchestrated crises. The bureaucratic structure ensured that no single analyst had access to complete records, that source materials were distributed across multiple security classifications and archive locations, that the only people who could see the whole picture were the very people who had created it and who had no interest in exposing their methods. I had been given temporary access to comprehensive materials about Naboo because someone had determined that no one could look at those specific records and extract the pattern I had found, that the events were far enough in the past and involved enough complicated details that the orchestration would remain invisible to normal analysis. They had miscalculated, or I had been unusually perceptive, or perhaps some combination of both, but regardless of how it happened, I now understood something I wasn't supposed to understand, and that understanding made me liability that the system would need to eliminate once it was discovered. I continued working on the official assignment while I processed this realization, prepared the sanitized educational materials that portrayed the Naboo crisis as example of Republic dysfunction and Jedi overreach, wrote the lesson plans that would teach Imperial children to view the old order as corrupt and the Empire as necessary correction. The work felt like producing poison, like contributing to systematic erasure of truth that made genuine historical understanding impossible. But I completed it professionally because failing to deliver would trigger immediate investigation into why I was struggling with straightforward revision assignment. I submitted the materials through proper channels, received approval from my supervisor, and returned to normal duties while waiting to see whether my unauthorized synthesis of source materials had been detected by whatever surveillance systems monitored archivists for exactly this kind of ideological contamination. The investigation came 6 weeks later, not dramatic arrest, but quiet summons to an ISB facility in the Undercity, where political reliability assessments were conducted for personnel who worked with sensitive materials. The interviewer was professional and thorough, asked detailed questions about my revision process and what sources I had consulted and whether I had discussed my work with anyone outside official channels. I answered honestly about the process, while concealing my actual conclusions, described the materials I had reviewed, while omitting my synthesis of patterns they revealed. And I think I almost passed the assessment until the interviewer asked one specific question that revealed how much they already knew. Did you notice anything unusual about the timing of Qui-Gon Jinn's death? Anything that suggested it might have been orchestrated rather than random outcome of combat? The question was trap, way of determining whether I had made the connections they were concerned about, and my hesitation before answering apparently confirmed their suspicions because the interview terminated immediately, and I was informed that I was being placed on administrative leave pending full security review. I left the facility knowing that full security review meant eventually I would be arrested and interrogated using methods that would extract everything I knew, that my understanding of the Naboo manipulation and its connection to larger imperial origins would be documented and classified and used to determine whether I required re-education or elimination. The Empire couldn't tolerate people who understood how it was actually created, couldn't allow historical records to reveal the decades of manipulation that had preceded its formation, because that knowledge undermined the legitimacy narrative that claimed the Empire emerged from Republic corruption rather than from systematic destruction of Republic institutions by the very person who eventually declared himself Emperor. I had maybe days before the arrest order was issued, maybe a week if bureaucratic processing was slower than normal.